Okay, so this video is going to focus on sources. It's going to talk a little bit about different types of sources and where to find that information. So what are some good sources we can use? Well, experts are great sources, right? People who work in that field and have a lot of information about that field. So this can be doctors, politicians, CEOs, right? If I wanted to learn more about Microsoft, Bill Gates might be a good source. If I wanted to know more about the UN, then something that Ban Ki-moon wrote or talked about could be a very good source. Experts are a great source, but oftentimes we forget about personal stories. Personal stories are also a great source. People who have actually experienced something. So, for example, someone who fought in World War II or a person who climbed Mount Everest. These people have stories and experiences that you can use. Most of us would get our information, though, from news sources. Now, the news source might talk about experts or people who have a personal story, but they're written by writers that work for the company. When you use a news source, make sure it's a well-known, accredited news source. So there are many different things that seem like news. However, it's not really news. So be a little careful about where you get your information. So now we'll look at two types of sources. News sources, sources like BBC, CNN, the New York Times, these are what we call a secondary source. What a secondary source is a source that gets information from somewhere else and then they provide that information to you. There's also what we call the primary source. A primary source is when you hear information directly from the person. Let's look at primary sources first. So primary sources are direct information, information from someone, for example, who experienced something, or information directly from the government. It can also be like an interview. So for example, if you see an interview of the President of the United States, well, that's a primary source, the words that come out of the president's mouth. It can be autobiographies, books that the person wrote themselves, or it can be something like these scholarly journals. All of these are primary sources. Secondary sources is information from another source. So not directly from the person or the organization that has the information. So for example, most news is a secondary source. Most books are secondary sources. And even scholarly journals can be a secondary source. So let me give you an example of like how a book can be a primary or a secondary source. If I write a book about Moon Jae-in, well, that is about a person. However, it's not him personally writing the book. So that would be a secondary source. If Moon Jae-in writes a book about himself, well, that's an autobiography, and that could be a primary source. Here's two pictures of Nelson Mandela, a very famous South African man who passed away a few years ago. Now you look at this picture. The picture on the left would be a primary source. If you went to go watch him speak, well, those are the words coming directly from his mouth. That would be a primary source. If you read a news article about him in Time magazine, well again, that would be a secondary source. You might be wondering what type of source is better, a primary or a secondary source. They both have a purpose. So for example, a secondary source can fact check a primary source. If the President of the United States says something that is inaccurate, a secondary source like BBC or CNN can fact check that. They can say that the information was accurate or inaccurate. But there's a problem with secondary sources. Have you ever played this game called telephone, where you say something to someone and they say it to someone else, they say that to someone else, and so on? By the end of the line, usually the word or the phrase that you started with is very different from the beginning to the end. This is a problem with secondary sources. Information, the more times it's used, can be distorted. So using a primary source is actually a very good way to get information because primary sources come directly from the source, directly from the person or the organization that has the information. So whether we're talking about a primary or a secondary source, there's a very basic life skill that we all need to do. The life skill is to ask questions. You want to question the source, even question the actual information. Does this information seem logical? But also question the agenda of the people who are giving you the information. People, news organizations, governments, they all have their own bias and agendas. Bias is to state how you feel about something, whether you like or dislike something. Agenda is what you want to accomplish. So for this example here, an oil company CEO might say that global warming is a myth. Why would they say global warming is a myth? Well, if you're an oil company CEO, you want people to buy oil. So just be very aware that different sources are going to give you different information because they have different biases and agendas. So where can you find good information then, with all of these problems with biases and agendas? Well, there are a few places you can look. However, you still have to remember that governments, organizations, even scholars and scientists, oftentimes they have their own bias and agenda. So just always be aware of that when you do your own research. Google Scholar is actually a great place to find information. If you don't know Google Scholar, write it down, use it. Because Google Scholar can lead you to scholarly journals and a lot of different types of books. But you still have to be a little careful about biases and agendas. So I keep talking about scholarly journals, scholarly journals. Well, these journals are the best sources of information. They're the most credible types of sources. Now, there still can be problems with them, that is true. But in general, these are good sources. These are sources that have been reviewed by peers of that community. So what that means is maybe I'm going to write a paper on motivational learning. What motivates students to learn? I write that paper, I send it to the journal. Now, what the journal is going to do is they're going to have other people who are experts in the field read my paper. If it seems like it's a good piece of research, they'll publish it. If it doesn't seem very good, they won't publish it. They'll send it back. So scholarly journals are great because other people have read it and credited or discredited the information.